Good afternoon, everyone. Today it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. He is currently a wildlife conservation major. He is here to talk to you about how to choose the proper firearm for hunting various species of game birds. He has been hunting and handling rifles and other types of firearms since he was 6 years old. He is on the Virginia Tech Clay Target team here and serves as the treasurer for that student organization. And I'm sure, as most of you have noticed his absence the last couple of weeks, he has most recently been competing at the national level in Clay Target. So, without much further ado, here's Garrett Stroh.
Thank you, Emily. It's my pleasure to talk to you guys here today about the proper steps to take when looking at a firearm, assessing which cartridge will be appropriate for the animals of which you want to harvest. So you may wonder why this is an important question to begin with, but it really does affect the quality of meat that you will receive when you harvest an animal. It helps, and hunting helps keep populations in check through stopping disease spread and promoting a bountiful food source. How many of y'all have been hunting before? 2? Okay, cool. Just wondering. So it's one thing to assess when selecting the proper shotgun gauge when going after game birds is how much power do you actually need. When shooting at a very large bird with a very small gauge, which would make it so a minimal amount of pellets get into it, there's a higher probability of you injuring the animal needlessly and it escaping. It then has to suffer and try to heal. Most of the time, if it does heal, it's improperly, its wing might be not functional any longer, or it dies of these wounds in a painful way, such as infection, or gets eaten by a predator. So we don't want that. So there's 6 gauges of shotgun cartridges, but there's 4 really main ones, which I'll focus on mainly today because the other 2 are pretty much rarities, they're pretty much phased out. So from a trick with knowing how the size of the shotgun shell, the larger the number, or the smaller the number, the larger the bore, which is the diameter of the shell itself. So from smallest to largest, there's the 410, the 28, the 20, the 16, the 12, and the 10. The 4 main cartridges that you'll find commonly used within hunting, and if you're ever at Dick's or something looking at ammunition, you'll notice you'll probably mainly see 410, 28, 20, and 12 gauge. 16 was a popular gauge back in the 70s, 60s, but it's kind of been phased out. And the 10 gauge is primarily only used by a select few hunters that think they need it for goose hunting. So our first choice of shotgun, I'm going to cover these from largest to smallest, is the 12 gauge. That is the most common gauge you will find used in any hunting situation ever. If you can hunt it, I can guarantee somebody's tried to hunt with that cartridge. It's also the most commonly used in clay target sports. Like when I was in Texas, that's all we used, 12 gauge. The advantages of using a 12 gauge, it's incredibly common. There's a ton of various weird types of ammunition. Any shot pattern or size that's ever been made is available in it. Shot size denotes the size of the BBs within the shell. So obviously the larger the BB, the less you can fit in there. So the advantage of having this large diameter shell is you can fit large shot sizes in higher quantities. This makes these very ideal for hunting waterfowl that are larger, such as ducks, Canadian geese, tundra swans. But it's a little bit much for, say, a small upland game bird like a quail. If you shoot it with 400 pellets of 7.5 sized pellets, which are small, it's the same deal with this. The larger the number, the smaller the shot size. You're going to wreck most of the meat on the quail. So ideally, you don't want to use a 12 gauge for most upland hunting situations. Maybe you can get away with it with a pheasant, but other than that, we're going to want to look at some of the smaller gauges. So the next gauge I'm going to talk about is the 20 gauge. The 20 gauge is seen by most upland hunters as the most ideal all-around upland gun. No upland game bird, outside of maybe a turkey, you're going to need like a 12 gauge for. The 20 gauge is perfect for pheasant, chucker. Pheasant's about the size of a football, chucker's maybe like the size of a Nerf football. Very ideal for this. It might still be a little bit much for a small game bird like a woodcock or a quail or a dove, but it doesn't have enough shot pattern to completely destroy the birds regardless. And it optimizes the amount of shot you make into the bird without destroying it, which is our most important goal, because why are we hunting? We're hunting for food and hunting for conservation purposes. So 20 gauge isn't necessarily ideal for waterfowl because you can't fit those large shot sizes into the shells in high quantities in order to properly harvest the bird without injuring it. But for these smaller game birds, we'll move on to the next gauge. This next smallest gauge is known as the gentleman's gauge, the 28 gauge. Mainly found in very fancy side-by-sides and over-unders, used primarily for rabbits, quail, woodcock, these small birds. It's ideal because it's much smaller than the 20 gauge in diameter, but its ballistics are actually very similar. Essentially it's shot pattern, which is the spread of the BBs. Because do you all know how the shotgun shells work? I should have asked that question. I'm sorry. So a shotgun shell is essentially a bunch of little tiny projectiles in what's called the wad, which is essentially just a cup. And when you fire it, they come out of the barrel in a string pattern and spread out. So that's what makes it ideal shooting at flying targets, because it's not one projectile, it's many. So these projectiles fly at a similar ballistic pattern, I guess you would say, as the 20 gauge with half the shot. So you can hit birds just as hard without getting as many pellets into it and destroying the meat. The final shotgun shell that's commonly used with hunting is the 410. It's actually so small, it's assigned a caliber instead of a shotgun gauge. If it was using a gauge denoted, I think it'd be like a 67 gauge or something. It's very small. There's not many advantages to this shotgun shell, in all honesty. They're about twice the price for a box as any of the other calibers or the gauges. But it does have one very, very good advantage. When you're getting a small child into hunting for the first time, and you don't want to just blow them away with a large gauge and scare them and make them gun shy for the rest of their life, a 410 is a very optimal choice for getting these kids involved. And that's a very important step in hunting because it's a dying sport right now. You need to get children involved with the sport itself, make them like it at a young age, and then eventually they'll progress through the gauges until they're big enough to handle and pick which gauge they want to choose themselves. So, in conclusion, I want to ask y'all a few questions, see y'all's opinions, and there's no wrong answer, I'm just trying to get some information. So, if your hunting season mainly consisted of hunting dove, quail, and maybe just a tiny bit of chukar, and you were a smaller framed individual, what gauge would you probably choose? 28, general consensus. Good, that's generally what I would go with too. 28 is a very good cartridge. They're a little bit more expensive than the 20 and 12 just because they're not quite as common, but they're still readily available. It's powerful enough to take down the chukar, but still not destroy the little dove and quail. So that's a good choice. If you're just a waterfowl hunter, what would you shoot? What would you choose?
12.
12. That's a good option as well. And the cool thing about the 12 is if you hunt other animals such as deer and everything else, it's quite optimal as well. I mean, you can put buckshot in it. And then obviously for children, we covered 410 is probably a good place to start. And here's a tricky one. What if you hunt pheasant, but on occasion about twice a year, you hunt doves?
You buy two different types.
No, out of the common four.
20.
20 would be a good one. 20 would be a good choice because you can still get it and you can still get steel shot for it because waterfowl you have to hunt with steel shot. They still have decent ballistics and decent space to fit enough of that large shot in it to hunt the upland, like the waterfowl, sorry. But you're not going to blow up all the pheasant with the 12 gauge. So it's a good choice. With that, if anybody has any questions regarding upland hunting, shotguns in general, the shotgun sports, I'm also knowledgeable on that.
Could you clarify again, like You said those numbers indicate how many balls are in there?
So these numbers, it's kind of hard to tell from the screen. These numbers denote the diameter of the shell itself. So how big the barrel will be and how big, like, around the shotgun shell would be. I wish I could have brought it in, but I don't know if campus police would like that too much. So the larger this number is, the smaller the diameter of that shell actually is. So a 10 gauge is a great big hunking barrel with a great big cartridge in it. You can fit a bunch of shot in it. Versus the 410, which is in reality like a 67 gauge or something very small. You know, it's only about that big, about the size of a Sharpie or something. So, and with a lot more space in the shell, you can fit more pellets. That's essentially how it works. Like with 8-shot, which is a small shot, which is what we compete with, in a 12 gauge, you might get 400 pellets. In a 410, you might get 175.
So whenever you clean it from the bird, like, you have to actually take the bullets out, right?
Well, I mean, you get a few pellets in there, like, you just kind of eat around it. I mean, you pick most of it out. Most of the time, if you actually look, most of the shot actually gets trapped between the skin and where, like, the connective tissue that connects the skin to the meat is. On average, when I'm eating a quail, like a whole quail, maybe I'll get, like, find, like, a pellet or two in it. There's really not that much. But when I was discussing when you blow it up with a 12 gauge, half the meat might be torn up with pellets and just utterly destroyed. So that's why you want to try to optimize the amount of damage you do while minimizing the harmful damage that you do to the meat, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Well, this one has nothing to do with the gauges or things like that, but you mentioned when you talked about it being the gentleman's shot,
Mm-hmm.
over, under, and side by side. So what is that referring to?
Oh, okay. So I just call it, a lot of people call the 28 gauge the gentleman's gun just because of the type of people that use the type of guns. They tend to be more expensive, famously grade guns. And over, under is, have you seen the movies where they break open the shotgun and the shells come out and there's two barrels?
Yes.
So an over, under, the barrels are set up on top of one another, and a side by side, they're next
side
to
by side.
Yeah, they're side by side. They're next to each other.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was a term that was used for that.
Mm-hmm.
I understand now.
Any other questions? Cool. Thanks for your time, guys. I appreciate it.